Right, well, I'd like to introduce the second speaker, that's myself. And I'll be talking about Robert Irwin Howard. A while back, I gave a talk about H.P. Lovecraft, Aryan mystic, and he was one of a triumvirate of writers who wrote for a fantasy magazine called Weird Tales, a pulp magazine. It's incredibly cheaply produced magazines in the 1930s with quite good art, a graphic sort of art, printed on cheap bulk newsprint paper that was very acidic and fell apart very quickly. And yet three writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Irwin Howard, and Howard Phillips Lovecraft, have survived and have been inducted into literature. I saw in my local library that Penguin Classics, or modern classics, the ones with the grey covers, now include Robert Irwin Howard, Tales of Fantasy and Imagination from Cole to Conan, as a book. Penguin Classics, you say. So it begins as a pulp, and 100 years later it's redesignated as literature. Howard is a very interesting figure. He only lived 30 years. He was born in 1906 and shot himself with a revolver in the head in his car outside his home when he was 30 years of age. We'll get onto that afterwards. He wrote 160 stories, and the interesting thing about these stories is that they are pre-civilized in their settings, they're barbaric, they're ultra-masculine stories, and they deal with many themes which have been so disprivileged from much of mainstream liberal humanist culture that they no longer exist. Howard had a range of heroes and wrote in most popular genres. He wrote to make money, but he began as a poet, and a poetic and a sort of Saturnalian disposition influenced his work and his friendship by correspondence with Lovecraft, and to a lesser extent Clark Ashton Smith, throughout his life. He was of Irish descent, and he was born in a town which became a boom town in the oil booms of the early 20th century in Texas. For those who don't know, Texas is enormous. England fits into Texas 12 times and Britain 8 times. He was born in Cross Plains and spent some of his early life in a town called Brownwood, a quintessentially small-town American, which is the experience of most white Americans through the settlement of Western civilization in North America. The state capital, of course, is Austin, and you have the big cities like Houston, Dallas, and Galveston. Now, Howard hated the oil booms, and what happened? When the oil boom happened to Cross Plains, a town of about 1,200 with a mayor and so on, morphed into a large, sprawling, lawless place of about 10,000. Enormous number of prospectors and drillers and criminals and people seeking easy money, all heavily armed, of course, came into Cross Plains. The town burst out beyond its limits in all directions. Oil was discovered everywhere. Fortunes were made and fortunes were lost. At the time he was born, lynchings were still in vogue right across the South and the ex-Confederate states. Everyone displayed and carried weapons openly. Sometimes the Rangers, as they were called, were a man alone in the sand, in the sun, with a rifle, was basically all you had of semi-ordered civilization. People don't realise how, if you like, wild and open certain parts of the United States were, certainly until the 1860s, 1870s, and the psychological experience of an intuitive and sympathetic and radically imaginative young man like Howard invests the tall Texan story and the stories of prospectors and ranchers and drillers in the oil industry and Texas Rangers and marshals and so on with an added piquancy. His family supported the Confederacy in the previous generation, and he was mildly descended from certain Confederate commanders. His attitude towards life is expressed in the stories, which is why they've survived. The stories are like lucid dreams. You walk straight into them and the action begins. Most of them were dreams, and in a way most critics believe Howard's an oral creator. He's in the oral, folklorist and narrative-oriented tradition. He's a storyteller par excellence. It's said he wrote at night and he used to chant the stories to himself, which of course is a very old Northern European and Nordic tradition. It's the idea of the skald. It's the idea that things are illuminated to you and you speak because you hear the voice. He had a series of masculine heroes, beginning with certain Celtic and Pictish, Scotch-Irish heroes such as Bran McMahon and so on. Conan, the hero that he's most associated with, whose name of course is abstracted from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's middle name, Howard would take from all sorts of roots, many of which related to heroic Celtic Indo-European elements which he imagined to exist in his own past. He was very influenced by G.K. Chesterton's dictum at the beginning of the 20th century that myth is the commingling of emotional reality with what is understood to be fact. If you mix together eras and peoples, but you keep the emotional truth of the substance of what we perceive their lives to have been, then you can influence the present and the future. It's noumenal truth, as Aristotle said 2,000 years ago, the idea that certain things are artistically and emotionally true, irrespective of what you think about them factually. His most famous series of stories, the Conan stories that he wrote pretty much towards the end of his life, were based upon a false yet true, factional world history, the so-called Hyborian Age, that he created for himself. Maps of the Hyborian Age have been produced, and they are based upon a realistic sociology, ethnography, geological history, and a coherent view of economics. The country of Aquilonia that Conan ends up conquering at the end of the Mythos is partly Britain. The Picts are partly the Scots, of course, covered in woad, barbaric, kept out by a wall, that sort of thing. War is the dynamic of all of Howard's fiction, and his attitude towards life was conflict-oriented. His stories are described as ultra-masculine and non-feminist stories. Unkind critics say that they're Barbara Cartland for men, where all women are beautiful, all men are heroic, where magic works instead of science, and where force decides all social problems. And there is a degree to which the genre which he has founded, called Sword and Sorcery, of which one supposes J.R.R. Tolkien, an Oxford professor, is the senior representative in the 20th century, is an example of the literary and the heroic in contemporary letters. It's interesting to notice that the early great texts of the Western civilization, Homer, Beowulf, are deeply heroic, and yet over time the heroic imprimatur within our language and within our sensibility dips. It's said that boys aren't interested in reading at school, and that 80 to 90% of those who do English literature courses in further educational colleges and universities, the tertiary sector, are women. It's said that men don't disprivilege literature, and it's also said in the West that boys get bullied if they're regarded, as Howard was when he was younger, as sissies because they read too much, and this sort of thing. I think one of the problems is that literature that appeals to men is often not the concern of the people who run these sorts of educational establishments. If the sort of people that influenced Howard, people like Noyes, people like Robert W. Service, people like Byron, people like Kipling, people like the heroic imperialist literature of William Henley, who was the basis for Long John Silver in Treasure Island and was a close friend of Robert Louis Stevenson, a man who could go from bonhominy to murderous rage with the click of your fingers, as Silver does in Treasure Island, of course, because he moves from extreme malevolence to a sort of Cockney paternalism in the same breath. Now, this literature was normative much further down the social and the educational scale. One would imagine that boys and youngish men would be much more interested in literature as a whole. Howard essentially sold stories from about the age of 20, certainly 19. He started writing when he was 9. And the interesting thing about him is that his stories are not really derivative. There are connections to enormous writers that were prominent at the time, principally Jack London, but Howard emerged fully formed and had his own voice from the very beginning. London's a very interesting figure, because London's often been associated, truthfully and yet falsely, with the extreme left. Trotsky, of course, wrote an introduction to his famous dystopia of American life called The Iron Heel. And yet London, as George Orwell intimated in one of his essays, was proto-fascistic and was in many ways a left nationalist, or even a national Bolshevik, or somebody who would be now described as a third positionist. London's positions were those of socialism from the outside, but also a form of socialism, with and without quotation marks, that was right-wing rather than left-wing, and was both national and racial. The interesting thing about London's discourse is the radicalism of the racialism and the almost completely disavowed anti-Semitism.